Today we're going to be covering the topic of memory. Memory being chapter 8 of your book. We're going to look at how memory compares to a computer system, for instance, and modern views of how memory functions. We define memory as the ability to recall past events and past learning. It's actually, that seems like a really simple definition, but it's actually very complex. You can see here this is an MRI scan of the brain. The two areas lit up there are the hippocampus, which it's critical in the function of memory, both in storage and in recall. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Our earliest view of memory is this information processing model, which gives us three functions, three processes rather, that memory goes through. And it's very comparable to a modern computer. In fact, a lot of our computing technology is based on this information processing model of memory. We begin with encoding, where you put the information into the memory. This is like typing on your keyboard, where you're putting information into the memory in the first place. And then storage is hitting the save button so that it's recorded in the long term. And then retrieval is, of course, bringing the file back up later. If you can't retrieve the information, then it's not useful to you. It's not something that's functional without that ability to retrieve memory, even if it has been stored. And we'll talk more about retrieval failure later on as well. So we can use this information processing model, and it works. There's nothing wrong with the information processing model. It's relatively simple, it's easy to discuss, it's easy to visualize. We can use it very effectively. However, the information processing model isn't really how memory works. It is how computing memory works, but the human memory system is different. When we store information in our brain, we use something that's much more like the parallel distribution theory, where information and memories are stored as an integrated web of information. This is a relatively simplistic view of how we might visualize that parallel distribution theory, where you receive a piece of information and it triggers a memory. But that memory isn't triggered by itself. Instead, it triggers an entire network of information related to that object. For instance, in this image, the young woman sees the apple, and while apple is the core memory that's triggered, she also sees images for pie and grandma and horses, because they eat apples, and red and round and crunchy and all of these other things that are associated with apples, but they're also associated with other things, and so she can begin accessing this extended network of information without having to do a sort of linear search like a computer would have to do. So keep in mind that this parallel distribution model is the model that's more accurate to how the human mind works, even though we do tend to use the information processing model as an easier way to explain memory. This information processing model produces a system that's very similar to a computer. Because information moves in an extremely linear fashion through this model, it's easy to discuss and to talk about. For this model, information passes through stages of memory for encoding, storage, and retrieval. But it always begins with some stimulus from the environment. This environmental stimulus is picked up by the sensory organs, eyes, ears, skin, taste buds, that sort of thing, and processed into sensory memory. Now, sensory memory is actually something that happens sort of before this information reaches your brain, and it stores a massive amount of information for an extremely limited period of time. Your visual sensory memory, for instance, only lasts for about half a second, whereas your auditory sense memory lasts for about 2 to 4 seconds. This is actually really important. Without this half a second visual sensory memory, you wouldn't be able to watch television. Television is a sequence of still images that happen very, very quickly to give the illusion of motion, and we'll get more into that in sense and perception. But without the sense memory, what you would see was a sequence of still images. The same with auditory information. Without this auditory sense memory, you wouldn't be able to process our language because it travels too quickly. You have to store that information for a very brief period of time in order to process the information appropriately. Now, we don't keep everything that comes into our sensory memory. Instead, we process some of it into working memory. Working memory holds information for a relatively short period of time and can only hold a little bit of information. This information is stored just temporarily, just really while you're thinking about it. And then if it continues to be important, you can process that into short-term memory, which is then processed into long-term memory over a period of a couple of days. And we'll look more into how that is in just a moment. So for this three-stage model of memory, remember we have the sensory memory first. Okay, so everything that your senses take in is stored temporarily in sensory memory while you decide essentially whether or not to actually pay attention to it. Anything you don't choose to maintain inside your memory is discarded. It's essentially forgotten before you even realize that you should be remembering it. It's sounds in your daily life, for instance, the sound of your air conditioner, that you learn to ignore. Your sensory memory still takes it in, but you never process it into your working memory because it's not important. And that process is important with habituation. If you pay attention to what's coming in through your sensory memory, it gets processed into your working memory. Now, working memory generally only lasts for about 30 seconds. It's a segment of your short-term memory, and the short-term memory itself resembles long-term, except that it only lasts for about 3 days. Your working memory can store an extremely limited amount of information, only about 5 to 9 items of information can be entered into your working memory and held. We can maintain working memory for a longer period of time using a few methods that we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is essentially your working memory is anything you're thinking about right now. This is what you're conscious of at any given moment. And then if you choose to encode that information for long-term storage, it passes into your short-term and then into your long-term memory, which theoretically can store an unlimited amount of information forever. There's no point at which your brain can overload with information or fill up its hard drive like a computer can. Our brain stores information in a very different way. All right, we're going to have a quick test of Sperling's sensory memory test. So get out a sheet of paper and a pencil. Get ready to copy down what you see on the next slide and try and acquire as many of these letters as you can and capture them onto your slide. All right, I'm going to give you just a moment to get your pencil and paper out. All right, if we're ready, get ready to copy and go. How many of those letters did you get? Probably only about 4 or 5, and chances are you got the top row from left to right most accurately. So here's your answers. From the top row, left to right, most people can't get more than 4 or 5 because your sensory memory doesn't last very much longer than that, and that essentially caps out your working memory for assigning these random values because these letters don't have any particular sequence. You're essentially having to remember random values, which makes it far more difficult to remember specific items, specific instances. But remember that your brain doesn't store information the same way that a computer does. It doesn't store information bit by bit by bit. Instead, our brain stores information holistically. It stores it in a Gestalt way, which takes in a whole unit of meaning rather than simply a single unit of information. As information passes out of your short-term memory, it passes into your working memory. This is essentially everything you're thinking about right now. Your recalled memories, your daydreams, problems you're solving, what you're reading, what you're listening to, your grocery list, your laundry list, that sort of thing. It's a relatively small system. It can only hold so much information. Usually we refer to working memory as being between about 5 to 9 viable units of information. All right, and that is significantly larger than just one bit like a computer might have, but rather it encompasses an entire piece of information in that Gestalt fashion where you take an entire unit as part of your working memory system. Because working memory is a relatively small system, we have to find ways to expand that system. So, for instance, if you have a phone number, say 8675309, right? Now that's about 7 items, and that's actually why we have phone numbers that are 7 units long. What you're missing, though, is that we don't think about information this way. Instead, we think about information in this way, 8675309, as 2 units of information rather than 7 units of information, which is important, particularly if you add, for instance, an area code to that. Then you need 3 pieces of information rather than 10, which is too much really for anyone's working memory. Now, for those of you who recognize this particular phone number, you remember it in an entirely different way, holding 8675309 as a single unit of information in a song. Now, our minds are especially keyed to handle rhythms and poetry and music so that we can hold an entire verse as a single unit of information in our working memory rather than simply, for instance, one line or one word. Poetry really helps our memory systems by increasing and chunking information into much larger systems. The best way to keep things in your working memory is through rehearsal and repetition, doing it over and over and over again, which is why often you can end up doing things 4 or 5 times very quickly in a row before you commit that into your short-term memory so that you can remember it for a longer period of time. Repetition is one of the best ways of keeping information inside your short-term memory. When we started our discussion of the information processing model, we talked about the first process in that system as encoding memory, and we encode memory in different ways for each of the different kinds of memory. In order to get information into long-term memory, we have to begin processing it in a new and unique fashion. It's not simply enough to process information according to the sensory information that you're getting. Instead, we have to process that information in terms of what it means. And in order to do that, there's 2 ways to get information into your long-term memory. Automatic encoding is the easier way to do this. When you sit and listen to music over and over and over again, your very favorite song, you think it's totally cool and you're all into it, and you're bouncing around to it, and you've listened to this song like 5 dozen times, even if you weren't trying to remember all the lyrics, there's a very good chance that you can recall them fairly quickly, especially if you have that memory cue of the music itself to work from. This is what we refer to as automatic encoding. You haven't actually put any effort into coding this into long-term storage, but because you've exposed yourself to this information over and over and over, it's automatically encoded into your short-term and then into your long-term memory, simply because of repeated exposure. We can also look at effortful encoding. Now this usually requires you to spend work and energy into memorizing something. Music is very easy to encode, and you can do it very quickly. Simple things like a locker combination are also very easy to encode using automatic processing. Effortful encoding requires more effort and is good for things that are very complex, for instance, studying for exams or for your classes. It requires energy. It requires a dedication of time and effort. That's why it does feel tiring after you study. It is work because your brain absorbs an enormous amount of the energy that you're working with, and effortful encoding requires a significant expenditure of your body's energy. Your brain already consumes about a third of the sugars that you take in. When you're working with effortful encoding, it takes even more. So it is draining to be processing information in this way. Though effortful and automatic processing are absolutely parts of encoding memory, we actually have several different kinds of memory encoding that we use. The first and most simple, the one that you probably think about most often, is phonological encoding. This is encoding based on sound. When you get a phone number, for instance, you don't imagine the numbers in the phone number. Rather, you say them to yourself over and over and over in your head, right? 8675309, 8675309. You encode this memory based on how it sounds. That's phonological encoding, and it works just fine for working memory, particularly for things that you're actively working on. Visual encoding encodes based on how information looks, right? And sometimes that's necessary, something like memorizing a face or a painting. You have to remember how something looks in order to encode certain things, right? Maps, for instance, is another good example of visual encoding. It's often a little bit more difficult because we don't practice it as much, although visual encoding is actually extremely common among autistic individuals. Certain people have what we refer to as an eidetic or photographic memory. Usually this is actually a child thing. This isn't something that is usually retained into adulthood. And what we have is sort of the impression that someone with an eidetic memory can blink their eyes and photograph a whole book and be able to acquire all that information instantly. But that's not true. They still have to go through the information that they've acquired. Just because they have visually memorized the information doesn't mean they know what it means. And thus we have this final kind of encoding that's very important, which is semantic encoding. It's encoding based on what the information means. And this is what we get when we get into long-term memory. As for the most part, we don't memorize visual or phonological details inside our semantic memory. Next year, when you look back on this class, you're not going to remember these lectures. You're not going to remember these slides necessarily. What you should remember is the information and what it meant and how you use it. And that's semantic memory. Effortful encoding requires that we use special processes. We can't just repeat the information over and over and over again like we would, for instance, with a phone number. Rather, if you're going to try to remember something that's very complex, like, for instance, studying for a class, you need to use special methods in order to work with that information and make sure that it's stored semantically. And the first method that you can use is to find meaning for that information. You remember things better when you understand it, not just memorizing the information, but knowing what it means to you, right? And that meaning to you will be different than what it means to anyone else. You also want to elaborate or expand on that information, and that's why I always push that you should teach someone. If you're studying for a class, you should try to teach someone about that class, because teaching requires a level of elaboration to make sure that that other individual, be it your boyfriend or girlfriend or mom or your cat or your cactus, whatever, to make sure that that entity understands the information, you have to elaborate on it and make it understandable not only for yourself but for that other person. And that really helps. You should also organize information into a structure that makes sense to you. Now, this is one of the really unique things about memory, is that everyone's going to organize it differently. Your mental structure, your cognitive structure is radically different than anyone else's. So your organizational structure has to be unique and specific to you so that it works most efficiently. We can also use mnemonic devices. This is actually named after the Greek goddess of memory, Mnemos. Mnemonic devices are cognitive techniques that add additional information or intensified meaning onto pieces of information. I'll explain what that means here in just a moment. There are several different mnemonic devices that we can use to impose additional meaning on the information that we're acquiring. One of the simplest of these is, for instance, rhymes. I before E except after C is a rhyme that we use to help us spell words. It actually doesn't make a lot of sense because more words have EI than have IE, but we use the IE words more commonly. It's actually a French issue. The German words are spelled the other way. But this is an example of how we use rhyming to help us remember things. Humans are keyed psychologically to remember rhymes and poems very efficiently. We can also use first letters and acronyms. For instance, Roy G. Biv is what we refer to as a first letter sequence. This is for the colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. In order, Roy G. Biv helps you remember that. My son, on the other hand, uses a song to help remember the colors of the rainbow, so he uses more of the rhyming method than I do. Another method, for instance, my very excellent mother just served us noodles, is to help remember the order of the planets from the sun out, right? Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and so on. Kings Play Cards on family game shows is to help us memorize the order of taxonomy from kingdom, phylum, class. And it's simply taking the first letter of each of those sequences and applying them to the words that you're looking for. These mnemonic devices can actually be really helpful when you're looking to memorize information. The most difficult of the mnemonic devices that I'm going to go over today is actually the method of loci, and there are two methods. I think these are really interesting because my wife can use one method and I can actually use the other. The method that my wife uses most often is a location map. And in order to do this, you have a visual impression of a location, for instance, your house or a grocery store. And you use that visual impression in order to create a map through that location in order to help you remember everything you need. For instance, if you have a very good location map for your grocery store, you can use that location map to remember your shopping list. Being able to map a route through the grocery store in order to acquire everything that you need without forgetting anything. I can't use that method. My visual map of places is not that good. Instead, I use what's referred to as a memory palace. This is actually made famous by a couple of fictional characters. Sherlock Holmes used a memory palace, and Hannibal Lecter also uses a memory palace. There have been a few others, but those are the most famous. A memory palace is a fictional place that you create inside your mind. It has no real context, but you fill that location with memory triggers. For instance, you might have a statue that holds a scroll that gives the colors of the rainbow upon it. And then in another room, you might have a model of the solar system that helps you remember the planets. Memory palaces are extremely complex and difficult to construct. Don't count on being able to use a memory palace if you start creating one now. If you started creating one as a child, you can actually have a very elaborate memory palace because you train that very flexible, very plastic brain to work that way. I started as an adult. My memory palace contains only 2 subjects. And while it's very functional and useful for those 2 subjects, that's all I can manage to contain within it. And it is difficult to add to it because your memory palace cannot change. from moment to moment, from week to week, from year to year, unless you deliberately change it. So it's very difficult to construct a purely cognitive map of a place that cannot change. And that's a lot of the training that goes into the memory palace and why it's so difficult. Long-term memory is not one big homogeneous system. Rather, there are a series of divisions that we can give to long-term memory, and they all work a little bit differently. We can divide long-term memory up in its biggest aspects into explicit memory and implicit memory. Explicit memory are things that you can talk about, things that have conscious recall, things that you can bring up and look at and discuss. Implicit memory are memories that don't have conscious recall, things that you're not necessarily aware of, or things that you have difficulty bringing back up into your conscious memory. If we go back over to explicit memory again, we have, again, two big divisions where we can look at semantic memory and episodic memory, and there is some overlap with these. But semantic memory is what we would usually consider facts and general knowledge, right? It's information that you can pull up. Whereas episodic memory, on the other hand, deals with your memory of your life. It's sort of your personal diary, your personal TV show. It's episodic, right? It remembers episodes in your life. And you can call them up and think about them and talk about them. Implicit memory is the other way around. This memory that doesn't have direct conscious recall. And we can look down here at procedural memory. This is your motor skills and habits, things like tying your shoe. You know how to tie your shoe. You do it maybe every day. You sit down and tie a shoe very quickly. But if you try and teach someone else how to tie a shoe, you suddenly realize that you have no idea how to tie a shoe. And you have to stop and tie your shoe super slow and sort of pay attention to what your fingers are doing in order to remember how it's done. Because this procedural memory still remembers how to tie your shoe, what we refer to sometimes as muscle memory, still remembers how to tie the shoe. But it's not in explicit memory, so you have to sort of bring it back from your procedural memory by observing how you do it in order to be able to discuss it and teach this child how to tie their shoe. Classical conditioning is, again, implicit memory because it deals so much with instinct and instinctive responses. It's not keyed into your explicit memory, although you may have an explicit memory of the acquisition phase of the classical conditioning. The conditioning itself is part of your implicit memory. And then priming is how you bring, for instance, usually explicit memories or procedural memories up so that you can remember them very quickly. Priming is what happens when you sit down before a test and quickly review the information. You're priming yourself so that you can pull that information up very quickly when you see the relevant question on your test. Once we've encoded and stored the memory, we also have to retrieve the memory. Now, there's two theories on how we do this, one of which is kind of outdated, although we still use it with computers. The other is more how humans actually retrieve our memories. The search process is primarily something we use with computers and not with humans. The search process, if you go into your computer and you open up the search menu and you type in the name of the file that you're looking for, your computer searches its data banks and finds one file after another after another after another and checks each one individually to determine whether or not that's the file you're looking for. If it bears a resemblance to what you typed in, it then displays it so that you can make a decision. That's a search process, but that's not how you make a decision. It would take far too long. The human brain stores an enormous amount of information, far, far more than any computer could possibly store. So instead, we use a more advanced process referred to as an activation process. When you receive a code, essentially, that gives some trigger in your memory, instead of searching each file individually, your brain calls up that single piece of information and then the entire network, the entire schema that it's attached to. So that gives that whole information web all at once. And then you have to decide beyond what parts of that information web are relevant for you to pull up and actually use in your working memory. And we do this very, very quickly. So that is the activation process, where you actually pull up sort of all of the information related to a memory trigger or a memory key, rather than searching each file individually. So what sort of things can help us retrieve memory? Well, we start with retrieval cues, right, which is any word, sight, or other stimuli that can trigger a memory. A recognition task is one kind of retrieval cue. This is, for instance, a multiple choice test, where you have a basic retrieval cue in the question, and then a sequence of possible answers. Now, you know your answer is one of those. It has to be. But all you have to do is recognize, this piece of information is tied to this piece of information, so that must be the right answer. Recognition tasks are relatively simple. Recall tasks are a bit more complex. Things like essay questions, where you're given one tiny piece of that recall cue, one tiny piece of that retrieval cue, and then you have to recall a great deal more information without any further recognition ability. Which is why often it helps if there's both essay and multiple choice, because sometimes your multiple choice can help you answer those essay questions. So that's retrieval cues. And then we can also use priming. Like I said, when you come in before your test and you sit down with your book and start, going over things and asking people test questions before the test, that's priming. And all that is bringing the information sort of to the surface so that it can be quickly retrieved when a retrieval cue appears. We can also have context and state effects. Right? We have a tendency to remember things best in the same kind of place where we first learned them. This is part of why when astronauts are doing training, they have models and mock-ups of the space shuttle, and they maintain everything exactly the same way it's going to be in the space shuttle, and they wear the spacesuits and everything, so that they can accurately recall the information that they acquired during training. They can activate all of those sensory cues when they're actually in space. And then state effects show that you remember things best in the state where you first learned them. I had a friend, for instance, who was absolutely a pool shark. He was amazing. He could run a table like nobody had ever seen, as long as he'd had a few beers first. He almost could not remember how to play pool when he was sober, because he never learned to play when he was sober. He only ever played when he was slightly inebriated. So while he was extremely good when he was inebriated, when he was sober, he was never any good. And that's an example of state effects, and why I encourage you always to study when you're sober or when you're under the effects of the same prescription medication that you will be using for instance, ADD while you're taking your test. So state effects make a big difference as well. In theory, we should be able to remember things essentially forever. Our long-term memory is unlimited and indefinite. So why do we forget? We have three primary theories on why we forget things. There is first encoding failure, simply that you never learned it in the first place. It was never placed in the long-term memory. You didn't encode it properly, and so it was unable to become part of your memory system. Storage failure is almost always a biological problem. Some form of head trauma has damaged the storage medium in which that memory was kept. This actually happens with a lot of head traumas. This happens with several different kinds of dementia, this form of storage failure. And then we have retrieval failure, which is the inability to get that information back. It's stored, but you can't retrieve it. For instance, tip of the tongue syndrome, where there's a word or a name and you know that you know it, but you can't get it all the way out. That's retrieval failure. So why do we have retrieval failure. Well, again, we have another 3 reasons why we have retrieval failure in particular. We have decay theory, interference theory, and motivated forgetting. So let's talk about those for a moment. Decay theory was discussed by Friedrich Ebbinghaus, who was the first to study memory in a scientific fashion. And what he would do is he would take a sequence of random syllables, mab, talk, just things that don't make any sense, usually 3-letter syllables. And he would write lists of about 20 of them, and he had a whole bunch of these lists. So he would memorize a list. What he referred to as learning a list was being able to memorize the list, set the list aside, and immediately get 100% on a test of those things. So if it took him, for instance, 30 minutes to memorize 20 syllables, then he had a 30-minute learn. Okay, so he learned it in 30 minutes. And what he found was that the longer he took to take the test, the more information he forgot. In fact, this forgetting curve happened extremely fast. Within the first few hours, he lost almost 40%. Within the first day, almost 60% of the information that he'd acquired. Within the first 2 days, he could remember approximately 35 to 40%. And by the time about a week had passed, he could remember about 20% of what had been memorized. So this is your learning curve. And the learning curve is this sort of exponential curve where it falls off very rapidly at first and then stabilizes. So that information that you remember after, say, a week will still be remembered for an extremely long time. Okay? So this is what he referred to as the forgetting curve. He also described the primacy effect and the recency effect. And my wife discovered these sort of all on her own. She used to send me shopping with a list, and she would tell me what the list was. And it would have, say, 5 items on it. And I would go to the store and I would get the first item and the last couple of items on the list, and then a couple of things that I just made up because I knew there was more to it. The fact that I remembered the first item accurately is an example of the primacy effect. The primacy effect occurs because the first things that you're given in a list of information stay in your memory for somewhat longer. They have less interference than other things that are placed into your memory. So you have a tendency to remember them and place them into your short-term memory more accurately. The recency effect is sort of the opposite of that, where you remember the last few things in a list better than the things in the middle as well. And that's simply because there's nothing that's being placed into your memory to replace them. So they stay in your memory. Again, they stay in your memory for a longer period of time and have less interference from other aspects of memory systems. The things in the middle get muddled up and lost. Right? So the primacy and recency effect show us why we remember the first and last things in a list more efficiently. Ebbinghaus also talked to us about spaced practice, which helps you remember more efficiently, and overlearning. Remember, if we learn information for 30 minutes to remember his whole list, if he studied that list for an hour, what he referred to as 100% overlearning, what he determined was that that 40% that he could remember after a day went up to 60%. That there was a dramatic increase in the amount of information that he was able to retain over time. Overlearning, remember, is simply studying beyond the point at which you could immediately recite that information once. Ebbinghaus also talked about interference, right? Having new or old information block the ability to retrieve information in one form or another. Proactive interference occurs when old information blocks your memory of new information. One of my favorite songs is Drift Away, and it was performed by Dobby Gray first, so I grew up with the Dobby Gray version of Drift Away. As an adult, I discovered that Uncle Kracker had done Drift Away, and I was really excited because it was going to come back in style and be a thing again. And I started listening to it only to realize that Uncle Kracker does not know the words to this song. I was never able to remember Uncle Cracker's version, and I still don't like it. But this older information that I'd grown up with and loved my whole life blocked my ability to remember the new version of the song. That's actually a fairly common occurrence. Retroactive interference is the other way around, where new information blocks the memory of old information. When you get a new phone and a new phone number, for instance, it can take you a little while to remember that new phone number, where you do have that proactive interference. But once you have the new phone number memorized, after a little while, you may realize you don't remember your old phone number anymore. That's the example of retroactive interference, where remembering your new phone number prevents you from remembering the old one. This is perhaps a useful graphic to remember which is proactive and which is retroactive interference. I still have trouble remembering this, so if you want to use it for a paper or something, you might consider that, but otherwise, don't worry about it too much. Motivated forgetting is another way that we have retrieval failure for our memories. When we have retrieval failure, we are motivated to forget information. With suppressed memories, we deliberately try to forget information that is traumatic or painful. And this is the memory system that we use now, is this suppressed memory theory. We deliberately attempt to forget it and sort of scab over it in order to protect ourselves from that unpleasant memory. Memory repression is a Freudian system, and we don't really discuss repressed memories anymore because it's not a useful system. With repressed memories, we attempt to totally block information away from conscious awareness, and we shove it down into the deep unconscious, and the id covers it up, and it becomes part of the thanatos drive that causes you to have sort of self-destructive behaviors. Now, that's all Freudian theory. And again, we don't really use it anymore. Instead, we use memory suppression in order to explain motivated forgetting. The misinformation effect is also a common way. We can essentially remember things that never happened, and there are a few ways that we can do this. Source misattribution is actually very common. When you hear someone who remembers an event that happened when they were a year old, they don't. We all have an effect called infantile amnesia, where you don't remember information from before you could talk. Our memory systems are so reliant on our ability to encode information by meaning that language is the primary system we use to encode memory. So you never remember information from when you were a year old. What you do is you take the story that you've been told, the story from when you were a year old, and you misattribute the source of that information. So you've been told by your parents that this happened, and over time misattribute the source of that memory from your parents to yourself, imagining that you actually remember this information when really you don't. We can also have exposure to misinformation, which is actually quite common as well. There's actually what we refer to as the Mandela effect, or Mandela effect. It was based on a rumor about Nelson Mandela that never actually happened, and people absolutely remember. They remember when Nelson Mandela was shot and killed, but Nelson Mandela was never shot and killed. It didn't happen. We're exposed to this misinformation, and it makes an emotional impact on us. And so we imagine remembering this information when in reality we don't. Exposure to misinformation is particularly dangerous in, for instance, children, where leading questions can cause children to remember information that never happened. There was an enormous scandal, actually, with exposure to misinformation in the 80s, where children were recalling information about how they were being abused in the basement of a private daycare. That they were being forced to engage in ritualized Satan worship and being sexually abused in the basement of this daycare. This daycare didn't have a basement. It didn't exist. There was no basement for them to be being abused in. And what it eventually turned out to happen was that these individuals were being led, they were being exposed to this misinformation and trying to please the adults who were asking them questions. And so they were essentially generating new memories of events that never occurred, and it became a nationwide scandal. Only very recently was the family compensated for the complete ruination of their business and their reputation over these false allegations. We can also have the effects of imagination. Our own imagination can lead us to recall events that never took place. This is actually very common with readers, for instance, where very often a reader will remember events in a book as though they were there. They remember sights and smells and tastes of these events, knowing that it took place in a book and not in reality. But these memories are still very real. This can happen in dreams as well, where we have extremely vivid dreams and we remember them as though they were real. Note that misinformation is not the same as disinformation. Disinformation occurs when you are being given deliberately misleading information so that you don't ask too many questions, particularly by, for instance, government or law enforcement sources. So why are our memories so easily corrupted by this misinformation effect? Because when we recall information, we're not actually recalling the information itself. We're not recalling our memory of that event. We're recalling the last time we remembered that event. And every time we remember it, we re-encode that memory with a slightly different spin based on our mindset, our emotions, our thoughts, our considerations of that memory. It's re-encoded and slightly changed. So you can recall information in a radically different way each time you remember it. So what does memory look like in our brain? We actually have several particular segments of our brain that are very important for memory, even though we appear to store memory throughout our brain structure. The prefrontal cortex is located in the very front portion of your brain, just behind your forehead. It's absolutely implicated in working memory and your ability to plan ahead, your ability to decide what it is that you want to remember, what it is that you want to encode, what it is that you want to retrieve. The hippocampus is this lit up area down at the base of the brain. It's an important temporary storage site for long-term memories and encodes memories to transfer into and from the relevant sensory areas of your brain as well. So that gives you sort of a switchboard for your brain and for your memories. Damage to your hippocampus may cause you to be unable to retrieve or store new information. For a long time, we believed that memory was stored in accordance with neural circuits, that the long traditional neurons that you think about when you think about brain cells were what stored information in sequences of neural networks. We believed that long-term potentiation, actually storing information in electrical networks, was part of what stored that memory. Now we actually think that it's different, that we actually store information in a quantum holographic system, so that any one portion of your brain actually does store all of the information that you've ever acquired. But your ability to access that information may still be dependent on the neural circuits that you've developed. And of course, that you are developing all the time. Every time you learn something new, you develop new neural circuits in order to acquire and use that information. So how does your memory change as you get older? We believe that your memory actually memory peaks, and memory and related cognitive functions peak around the age of 25. Some people do it a little bit sooner, some people do it a little bit later. However, that shouldn't be taken to mean that people who are older than 25 are having trouble with their memory, because that's not necessarily the case. We know that certain forms of memory function do absolutely decline as you get older. In particular, your ability to maintain large amounts of information in working memory, the ability to encode new memories quickly, certain aspects of episodic memories may become blurred as well, and elements of your short-term memory as well. We also have a tendency to pick and choose where we get information to remember, right? As we get older, we become more and more selective about the sources of information. For instance, I never remember anything that I see on Fox News. I just don't remember it. By the time I leave the room, it's gone, because that information is irrelevant. I just assume that it's false. However, certain other forms of information, like from routers, is information that I do remember for a significant period of time. Even though that is a relatively conservative source, I can find good confirmable information there. As we age, we think that our brain does have some damage to the hippocampus, although the original studies that suggested that hippocampal deterioration happens was actually done primarily on gay men who had AIDS. And we know now that the HIV virus does actually attack and damage the hippocampus, so it may not have anything to do with age, but rather with that virus. Dementia and disease also affects all of these forms of memory, and dementia, particularly Alzheimer's, is something that your brain develops over time. Everyone's brain develops it over time. It's simply a matter of how long it takes. On the other hand, procedural memories of aging people show very little decline, and most implicit memories are retained very efficiently. Several types of short-term memory are also retained throughout aging, and the general knowledge effects that people acquire actually become significantly better over time, simply because you've had longer to acquire this information, and therefore you have more semantic memories than a younger individual has. There are two broad kinds of memory disorders that we can talk about. Organic memory disorders always have a biological cause. Diseases, head traumas, cancers, all of these are referred to as organic memory disorders. They're caused by a physical problem in the brain that causes you to be unable to retrieve or store information. We also have dissociative memory disorders, where there's no physical cause that results in memory loss. Organic memory disorders are by far more common. The most common, certainly the most commonly considered organic memory disorder is amnesiac disorders. You see this on TV all the time. Interestingly, the retrograde amnesia that you tend to see on TV and in movies is the least common, where the individual has trouble remembering things that happened before the amnesiac event, where someone, they wake up on a beach and they don't remember who they are or what they did for a living. That's what we refer to as retrograde amnesia, but they do remember everything that happens after the amnesiac event, so they have no trouble coding new memories. It's the old memories that they can no longer retrieve. This is actually a lot less common and requires very specific brain damage. Anterograde amnesia is actually a lot more common, where the individual can remember everything up to the traumatic event, but after that brain damage, and it's usually damage to the hippocampus, after that brain damage occurs, they can't form new memories. So they very quickly lose anything that's not stored in short-term memory. Their short-term memory usually remains intact, but the long-term memory can no longer encode information. This has occurred in a couple of movies fairly recently. 50 First Dates is an example of anterograde amnesia. Memento is the movie that I like that deals with anterograde amnesia, where it actually goes backwards, sort of, so that you don't remember anything that the character doesn't remember. He only remembers up to the event, and he's trying to solve essentially a murder, except that he has no memory. So it's a very neat movie to look at anterograde amnesia. Dementias are a form of memory and cognitive loss usually caused by some kind of organic brain damage. Alzheimer's disease is by far the most common, covering about 2/3 of all dementia, and it's believed that all humans will acquire Alzheimer's disease if they live long enough. Um, Alzheimer's disease is caused by plaques and neurofibrillary tangles in the hippocampus, causing a difficulty for storage and retrieval of memories. And it's simply plaques that build up over time. And there's nothing that we can do to stop it. You can slow it down by keeping the body and mind active and in exercise, but you can't stop Alzheimer's disease. It appears to accumulate in all brains. However, certain genetic codes may cause it to acquire far faster or far slower, depending on family heritage. Women appear to get Alzheimer's slightly more than men do, however. There are, however, other forms of dementia. Multiple infarct dementia is caused by a series of small strokes that damage portions of the brain and make it difficult to retrieve memories, therefore giving this dementia effect. So here's a graphic for being able to look at either retrograde or anterograde amnesia. The other form of memory disorder is a dissociative memory disorder, and these have no biological cause. These disorders are entirely caused by cognitive trauma, which does not mean that they're not real. Just because it's all in your head does not mean that it's not real. It absolutely is real. The most common of these is dissociative amnesia. And this, we actually had to deal with this a lot after the 9/11 attack, where individuals were traumatized by these events and were unable to recall important information about the attack in particular. Dissociative amnesia is very common in people who have been attacked, people who have had sudden traumas. It's very common in post-traumatic stress as well. Another issue that we had after 9/11 in particular was a dissociative fugue. This causes a person to enter a fugue state. Their original identity is essentially covered up by a new identity that does not remember the trauma. And what happened, particularly after 9/11, was we had individuals who would discard all evidence of who they were and essentially run away. And they would move states, even countries away, start a new life, start new careers, even starting new families, while they're in this fugue state and unable to remember their original identity. Then, months or years later, they may wake up remembering only the original identity and having no memory of the fugue state. This occurs while the brain is healing, essentially, while the mind is healing. And so you have this sort of scab over the original identity, and when it comes off, the original identity is again exposed. This can cause a great deal, sort of a refresher trauma when the individual wakes up without knowing where they are or why something is happening. Another very interesting form of dissociative memory disorder is dissociative identity disorder. This used to be called multiple personality disorder, but we don't use that term anymore. Partially because we're aware that these sub-personalities, or the alters, are not genuinely personalities. They're more like personality fragments. And yet, these personality fragments are actually very well developed and unique within that system. There have been several documented cases of dissociative identity disorder, but what's really interesting about it is that dissociative identity disorder is an almost exclusively Western thing. It occurs almost exclusively in the northern hemisphere or the northwestern hemisphere of the Earth, that is the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It doesn't really occur very much anywhere else. This is sort of a culturally bound psychological disorder, which they actually occur all over the world. But dissociative identity disorder appears to occur primarily only here, although there have been cases of dissociative identity disorder in Europe as well.